What happens when absolute power meets unbreakable courage? When Lord Aldwin Blackthorn ruled his lands with an iron fist, no farmer dared speak against him. His system was perfect: complain about his policies, and lose your land. Resist his demands, and face exile or worse. For 5 years, this reign of terror had crushed every voice of dissent, until he made the mistake of targeting the wrong man. Edmund Thorne was not just any farmer. He was a military veteran with tactical skills, deep community roots, and something that Lord Aldwin had never encountered before: the courage to organize resistance instead of accepting individual destruction. When the Lord's systematic persecution reached Edmund's doorstep, it sparked a rebellion that would expose decades of corruption and transform an entire kingdom. This isn't just another story about the rich oppressing the poor. This is the incredible tale of how one man's refusal to submit became a movement that brought down a tyrant, restored justice to countless families, and created protections that would last for generations. A story that proves ordinary people have extraordinary power when they stand together. Today I'm going to tell you how a simple farmer's decision to fight back against systematic oppression exposed a network of corruption so vast it reached the highest levels of government, and how his courage inspired reforms that protected agricultural communities throughout the realm. But first, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? I love seeing our global community grow. And if you're ready for a story that shows how justice can triumph over tyranny, how courage can overcome corruption, and how ordinary people can achieve extraordinary change, smash that like button and subscribe with notifications on. Because what Edmund Thorne discovered about fighting systematic oppression will prove that sometimes the greatest victories come not from accepting injustice, but from having the courage to stand up and say, enough. Are you ready to witness how one farmer's rebellion changed history? Lord Aldwin Blackthorn stood on the marble steps of his manor house, surveying the vast expanse of farmland that stretched beyond his estate with the cold satisfaction of a man who had accumulated power through systematic intimidation and ruthless enforcement of his will. At 45, he was considered one of the wealthiest landowners in the northern provinces, controlling nearly 20,000 acres of the most fertile agricultural land in the kingdom through inherited wealth, strategic marriages, and the systematic acquisition of properties from farmers forced to sell under increasingly desperate circumstances. The autumn morning was crisp and clear, perfect weather for the harvest beginning throughout the region, but Lord Aldwin felt no seasonal satisfaction as he watched distant figures of workers moving through the fields. To him, the farmers who toiled on lands that had once belonged to their families were nothing more than useful laborers whose continued presence depended entirely on their willingness to accept whatever terms he chose to impose. Over the past 5 years, he had perfected a system of control that made resistance virtually impossible, and rebellion economically suicidal for anyone foolish enough to challenge his authority. The method was elegantly simple in its cruelty. Any farmer who dared to speak publicly against Lord Aldwin's policies, who complained about the increasingly burdensome taxes and fees he imposed, or who attempted to organize collective resistance to his demands, would find their land confiscated through legal mechanisms that were technically legitimate but practically unstoppable. The local magistrates owed their positions to Lord Aldwin's political influence. The regional tax collectors were dependent on his financial support, and the constables who enforced eviction orders received generous payments for their cooperation. "My lord," came a voice from behind him, causing Lord Aldwin to turn toward his steward, Marcus Whitmore, a thin, nervous man in his 50s whose loyalty had been purchased through generous compensation and whose conscience had been systematically eroded through years of implementing increasingly harsh policies against farming communities. "The morning reports have arrived from our estate managers. 2 more families have fallen behind on their tax payments, and 3 farmers in the Eastern District have been heard making complaints about the new grain storage fees." Lord Aldwin's cold gray eyes reflected the predatory satisfaction of a man who saw every sign of resistance as an opportunity to expand his control and increase his wealth. "Excellent, Marcus. Begin foreclosure proceedings against the 2 families who are behind on their payments, and have our investigators gather detailed evidence about the complaints being made in the Eastern District. I want names, witnesses, and specific quotes that can be used to demonstrate deliberate defiance of our established policies." The system Lord Aldwin had created was designed to feed on itself, with each act of resistance providing justification for expanded control and each confiscated property generating additional revenue that could be used to strengthen his political connections and legal position. The farmers found themselves trapped in an impossible situation where silence meant accepting increasingly harsh conditions, but speaking out meant losing everything they had worked their entire lives to build and maintain. Marcus made careful notes in his leather-bound record book, documenting the Lord's instructions with a meticulous attention to detail that had made him invaluable in implementing policies that required precise legal justification to avoid direct challenge from higher authorities. Shall I also increase the surveillance in the market squares and taverns where farmers are most likely to gather and discuss their grievances? Our network of informants has been quite effective in identifying potential troublemakers before they can organize any significant resistance. Indeed, Lord Aldwyn replied, beginning to pace along the marble terrace that overlooked his private gardens and the sprawling farmlands beyond. Double the payments to our most reliable informants and recruit additional sources in communities where we have not yet established adequate intelligence gathering capabilities. I want to know about every conversation, every complaint, every whispered criticism before it has the opportunity to spread and inspire others to similar foolishness. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a rider whose urgent pace and travel-stained appearance suggested news of unusual importance. Lord Aldwyn recognized the man as Thomas Gray, one of his most trusted estate managers responsible for overseeing properties in the southeastern district where some of the most valuable agricultural land was located. The man's expression as he dismounted and approached the terrace carried a mixture of concern and excitement that immediately captured Lord Aldwyn's attention. "My lord," Thomas Gray said as he climbed the steps, slightly out of breath from his urgent journey, "I bring news from the Millbrook district that requires your immediate attention. There has been an incident involving one of the farmers there, a man named Edmund Thorne who owns a substantial property adjacent to the Riverside Commons. Yesterday evening, he publicly confronted our tax collector and made statements that could be construed as incitement to rebellion." Lord Aldwyn felt a familiar surge of anticipation as he contemplated the opportunity to make an example that would reinforce his authority throughout the region. Edmund Thorne's property was indeed substantial and strategically located, making it a particularly valuable addition to his holdings if the proper legal justification could be established for confiscation proceedings. "Tell me exactly what was said, Thomas," Lord Aldwyn commanded, his voice carrying the sharp focus of a predator who had detected promising prey. "I want precise details about the statements made, the witnesses present, and any evidence of his attempts to encourage others to join him in defying our established policies and procedures." Thomas Gray consulted his own notes, speaking with the careful precision of a man who understood that accuracy in reporting such matters could determine the success or failure of subsequent legal proceedings. Thorne accused our tax collector of extortion and claimed that the grain storage fees were designed to force farmers off their land rather than serve any legitimate administrative purpose. He called upon other farmers present to refuse payment and to petition the regional governor for investigation into our tax collection methods. Most significantly, he declared that he would rather fight than submit to what he termed legalized theft of farmers' livelihoods. Lord Aldwyn's eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction as he absorbed the details of Edmund Thorne's public defiance, recognizing immediately that the farmer had provided exactly the kind of clear, witnessed rebellion that would justify the most severe response under the legal framework he had spent years perfecting. The declaration that he would rather fight than submit was particularly valuable, as it could be interpreted as a direct threat against lawful authority that warranted immediate action to protect public order and maintain respect for legitimate governance. "Thomas, you have done excellent work in documenting this incident so thoroughly," Lord Aldwyn said, his voice carrying the cold approval of a man whose plans were falling into place with satisfying precision. "Begin immediate proceedings to have Edmund Thorne arrested for incitement to rebellion and seditious conspiracy against lawful authority. I want him taken into custody before he has the opportunity to spread his poisonous ideas further or to organize any coordinated resistance among the other farmers in his district." The legal mechanisms that Lord Aldwyn had established for dealing with such situations had been refined through years of practice and consultation with lawyers who were skilled in finding ways to make technically legitimate what was morally questionable. The key was to act quickly and decisively, overwhelming resistance before it could gain momentum while using the full weight of legal authority to justify actions that served his personal interests while maintaining the appearance of proper governance. Marcus Whitmore looked up from his note-taking with a question that reflected his deep familiarity with the procedures they had developed for handling similar situations. "My lord, shall we also begin surveillance of Thorne's associates and family members to identify any potential conspirators who might attempt to continue his resistance efforts? Our experience suggests that arresting the primary instigator often drives sympathizers underground rather than eliminating their opposition entirely." "An excellent suggestion, Marcus," Lord Aldwin replied, already beginning to calculate the broader implications of Thorne's defiance and the opportunities it might create for expanded control over the southeastern district. "I want comprehensive surveillance of everyone who was present during yesterday's incident, as well as monitoring of Thorne's family, his closest neighbors, and anyone who has had significant business dealings with him during the past year. This investigation will serve as a demonstration to the entire region of what happens to those who choose rebellion over obedience." The systematic nature of Lord Aldwin's approach to crushing dissent had been developed through careful study of successful authoritarian methods and consultation with political advisors who understood the psychology of intimidation and control. The goal was not simply to punish individual acts of defiance, but to create an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that would discourage future resistance while demonstrating the futility of challenging his authority through any means other than complete submission. Thomas Gray shifted uncomfortably as he prepared to deliver additional information that complicated the situation in ways that might affect Lord Aldwin's strategy. "My lord, there is one additional factor that you should be aware of before finalizing your response to this situation. Edmund Thorne is not simply an ordinary farmer with a small property and limited resources. He is a military veteran who served with distinction in the border wars against the northern barbarians, and he owns one of the largest and most prosperous independent farms in the southeastern district." This revelation caused Lord Aldwin to pause in his planning, recognizing that Thorne's military background and economic success created complications that required more careful consideration than the typical case of farmer resistance. A man with military training might prove more difficult to intimidate through conventional means, while his economic independence meant that he would be less vulnerable to the financial pressures that had proven so effective in forcing other farmers into submission. "Furthermore," Thomas continued, his voice reflecting growing concern about the implications of the situation, "Thorne's farm employs nearly 30 local workers during harvest season, and his family has lived in the Millbrook district for over 4 generations. He is widely respected in the community, and his public confrontation with our tax collector was witnessed by approximately 50 other farmers who seemed to respond favorably to his call for resistance." Lord Aldwin felt a flicker of unease as he contemplated the possibility that Edmund Thorne might represent a more formidable challenge than the isolated farmers he had previously dealt with so successfully. A man with military experience, economic resources, deep community connections, and the demonstrated courage to speak publicly against authority was exactly the kind of potential leader who could transform individual grievances into organized resistance that might prove difficult to suppress through legal mechanisms alone. "This information changes the strategic calculation significantly," Lord Aldwin admitted, beginning to pace along the terrace as he considered alternative approaches to dealing with a threat that might require more sophisticated responses than his usual methods. A direct confrontation with Thorne could potentially transform him into a martyr figure that inspires broader resistance, while allowing his defiance to go unpunished would encourage others to believe that my authority can be challenged with impunity. Marcus Whitmore, whose years of experience in implementing Lord Aldwin's policies had given him insight into the delicate balance between effective intimidation and dangerous overreach, offered a suggestion born from careful observation of previous situations where standard procedures had proven inadequate. "Perhaps, my lord, this situation calls for a more subtle approach that isolates Thorne from potential supporters while gradually undermining his position through methods that appear to be natural consequences of economic forces rather than direct retaliation for his political statements. Develop a comprehensive plan that addresses both the immediate threat posed by Thorne's defiance and the longer-term objective of acquiring his property while minimizing the risk of creating sympathy for his cause among other farmers," Lord Aldwin commanded, his strategic mind already beginning to formulate approaches that could achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. "I want options that range from direct legal action to more indirect economic pressure, with careful analysis of the potential consequences and benefits of each approach. 2 weeks after Edmund Thorne's public confrontation with Lord Aldwin's tax collector, the farmer found himself facing a coordinated campaign of harassment and intimidation that was more sophisticated and relentless than anything he had experienced during his years of military service against external enemies. Every aspect of his farm operation was being systematically targeted through legal challenges, economic pressure, and bureaucratic obstacles that seemed designed to force him into bankruptcy or submission without providing clear evidence of deliberate persecution. Edmund stood in his farmyard at dawn, reviewing the latest in a series of official notices that had been delivered by Lord Aldwin's representatives over the past several days. Each document represented a different form of pressure: demands for immediate payment of retroactive fees that had never been mentioned in previous assessments, requirements for expensive property inspections to verify compliance with newly implemented agricultural regulations, and notifications of pending legal proceedings related to alleged violations of land use restrictions that had been selectively enforced only against his property. The 38-year-old farmer possessed the lean, weathered build of a man who had spent his life performing physical labor, but his sharp green eyes and alert bearing reflected the intelligence and tactical awareness that had made him a successful sergeant during his 5 years of military service. Unlike many of his neighbors, Edmund could read and write well enough to understand the legal documents being used against him, and his military experience had taught him to recognize the patterns of systematic pressure campaigns designed to break an enemy's will to resist. "Father," called his eldest son, William, a sturdy young man of 19 who had inherited both his father's work ethic and his stubborn determination to stand up for what he believed was right. "3 more men have come to the door with official papers. They claim to represent different government offices, but they all have the same smell of Lord Aldwin's corruption about them." Edmund accepted the new documents with the grim resignation of a man who had expected escalation but hoped it might be delayed long enough for him to organize effective resistance. As he reviewed the papers, he felt a familiar mixture of anger and tactical analysis that had served him well during military campaigns against enemies who possessed superior resources but inferior determination. "What do they want this time?" asked his wife, Margaret, a practical woman in her mid-30s whose quiet strength had sustained their family through the hardships of farm life and who had supported her husband's decision to speak out despite understanding the risks involved. She emerged from the farmhouse carrying a cup of hot tea and wearing the expression of someone who had prepared herself for a long struggle against powerful enemies. "The first notice demands immediate payment of 800 silver pieces for what they call emergency road maintenance assessments on the lane that runs past our property," Edmund replied, his voice carrying the controlled anger of a man who recognized systematic persecution disguised as legitimate governance. "The second requires us to hire a certified inspector to verify that our grain storage buildings meet new safety standards that apparently went into effect yesterday, while the third threatens to confiscate our cattle if we cannot provide documentary proof that they were purchased through approved livestock dealers." Margaret's face hardened as she absorbed the implications of these new demands, understanding that their cumulative financial impact was designed to force choices between economic survival and continued resistance to Lord Aldwin's authority. How much would it cost to comply with all these requirements, assuming we could even find the approved inspectors and certified dealers they're demanding? Edmund made quick calculations based on his knowledge of local costs and the deliberately inflated fees that Lord Aldwin's associates charged for services that were required only of farmers who had shown signs of defiance. More than we could afford even in the best of years, and certainly impossible given that our grain sales have been blocked by the new licensing requirements they imposed last week. They've created a system where compliance is financially impossible, giving them legal justification for confiscation regardless of what we choose to do. The tactical situation was becoming clear to Edmund's military-trained mind. Lord Aldwin had abandoned direct confrontation in favor of a siege strategy designed to force surrender through systematic destruction of his economic foundation. It was an approach that minimized political risk while maximizing pressure on the target, and it would likely prove effective unless countered through equally systematic resistance that attacked the strategy's fundamental weaknesses. "William," Edmund said, turning to his son with the decisive manner of a commander who had identified the correct course of action despite its dangers, "I want you to ride to every farm in the district and arrange a meeting for tomorrow evening at the old mill. Tell them that Edmund Thorne requests the honor of their presence to discuss matters of mutual concern regarding recent changes in tax collection and agricultural regulation procedures." The decision to organize a public meeting represented a significant escalation that would force Lord Aldwin to choose between allowing organized resistance to develop or taking more direct action that might expose the systematic nature of his persecution. Edmund understood the risks, but his military experience had taught him that defensive strategies alone rarely succeeded against determined attackers with superior resources. Margaret placed her hand on her husband's arm, her touch conveying both support for his decision and concern about the consequences they might face. "Edmund, are you certain this is the right course? Lord Aldwin has already demonstrated his willingness to destroy families who oppose him, and organizing a public meeting will give him legal justification to claim that you're inciting rebellion or conspiracy against lawful authority." "I'm certain that surrender guarantees defeat while resistance offers at least the possibility of victory," Edmund replied, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had faced impossible odds before and understood that courage was often the only weapon available to those who lacked superior resources. "Lord Aldwin's power depends on our willingness to submit individually to pressure that we could easily resist if we stood together collectively. Our neighbors face the same systematic persecution, and they deserve the opportunity to choose between united resistance and individual destruction." William nodded his understanding and headed toward the stable to prepare for his crucial mission, while Margaret returned to the house to begin preparations for hosting a meeting that might determine the future of their family and their community. Edmund remained in the farmyard, studying the official notices that represented Lord Aldwin's declaration of war against everything he had worked to build and protect. As the sun rose higher over the familiar fields that his grandfather had first cultivated 60 years earlier, Edmund Thorne made a silent pledge that had been forged through years of military service and tempered by love for his family and his land. He would fight Lord Aldwin's systematic oppression with every resource at his disposal, and he would either win the right for honest farmers to live with dignity or ensure that his defeat would inspire others to continue the struggle until justice prevailed over tyranny. The old mill where Edmund Thorne had called his meeting stood at the intersection of 3 farm roads, a weathered stone building that had served as an informal community gathering place for generations of farmers who had no other venue where they could speak freely without fear of surveillance by Lord Aldwin's network of informants. As the sun set on the evening of the meeting, nearly 60 farmers arrived on foot, horseback, and in wagons, their faces bearing the grim determination of people who had reached the limit of their endurance and were prepared to risk everything for the chance to reclaim their dignity and their livelihoods. Edmund surveyed the assembled crowd with the tactical awareness of a military commander assessing the strength and reliability of his forces before engaging a superior enemy. These were not professional soldiers trained in combat and accustomed to following orders under extreme pressure, but they were men and women whose lives had been shaped by the constant struggle against natural forces and economic hardship that had given them a different kind of toughness and determination that might prove equally valuable in the fight ahead. "Friends and neighbors," Edmund began, his voice carrying clearly across the mill yard in the still evening air, "we have gathered here tonight because each of us faces a choice that will determine not only our own futures but the future of our children and our community. Lord Aldwin has created a system designed to destroy us one by one through legal mechanisms that make resistance appear futile and cooperation seem like the only rational choice for survival." The crowd stirred with murmurs of agreement and recognition as Edmund articulated the systematic nature of the oppression they had all experienced individually but had never before discussed collectively. Many of the farmers present had lost family members to economic pressure that had forced them to abandon their ancestral lands, while others lived in constant fear that any complaint or sign of defiance would result in similar destruction of everything they had worked to build. "But Lord Aldwin's power is not as absolute as he would have us believe," Edmund continued, his military experience enabling him to project confidence even in the face of overwhelming odds. "His system depends on our willingness to submit individually to pressure that loses its effectiveness when we stand together and support each other against systematic persecution. United, we have resources and capabilities that he cannot match through legal manipulation and economic intimidation alone." An older farmer named Jacob Millwright, whose family had lost their property 2 years earlier to confiscation proceedings that had followed his criticism of increased tax assessments, raised his hand to speak. "Edmund, we all respect your courage in speaking out, but what can we realistically accomplish against a man who controls the magistrates, the tax collectors, and the constables? Those of us who have tried to resist have lost everything, while those who have submitted have at least managed to keep their families fed and housed." The question reflected the fundamental challenge that Edmund had expected to face. Convincing people who had been systematically demoralized through years of oppression that effective resistance was possible despite their previous experiences of defeat and punishment. His response would need to address both the practical obstacles they faced and the psychological barriers that had been created through Lord Aldwin's deliberate strategy of making resistance appear hopeless. Jacob raises the crucial question that each of us must answer for ourselves, Edmund acknowledged, his tone respectful of the genuine fear and discouragement that had driven many farmers to choose submission over continued struggle. Lord Aldwin does indeed control many of the local officials who enforce his policies, but his power has limits that become visible when we examine the broader political and economic context within which he operates. Edmund moved to a wooden crate that served as an improvised speaking platform, allowing him to address the entire crowd while demonstrating the kind of leadership presence that had made him effective as a military sergeant. Lord Aldwin's authority depends on maintaining the appearance of legitimate governance that serves the interests of the kingdom rather than merely his personal enrichment. If we can document the systematic nature of his persecution and present evidence of his abuse of power to higher authorities, we can force him to choose between abandoning his current methods or exposing himself to investigation and punishment by officials who outrank him. Margaret Thorne, who had been standing quietly near the edge of the crowd, stepped forward to offer her own perspective on the strategic situation they faced. "My husband speaks truly about the limits of Lord Aldwin's power, but we must also be realistic about the risks we face and the resources we will need to sustain resistance over the time it takes to achieve meaningful change. Those of us who choose to stand together must be prepared to support families whose breadwinners may face imprisonment, whose properties may be confiscated, and whose lives may be threatened by men who profit from maintaining the current system of oppression." Her words sobered the crowd as they contemplated the personal costs that effective resistance would require, but they also helped focus attention on the practical preparations that would be necessary to sustain organized opposition to Lord Aldwin's systematic persecution. Several farmers began to discuss specific arrangements for sharing resources, providing mutual support, and maintaining communication despite surveillance and intimidation efforts. Thomas Greenfield, a prosperous farmer whose strategic thinking had made him successful in both agriculture and local trade, offered a suggestion that reflected careful consideration of their tactical options. "If we're going to organize effective resistance, we need to establish secure methods of communication that allow us to coordinate our actions without providing Lord Aldwin's informants with advance warning of our plans. We also need to identify farmers in other districts who face similar oppression and might be willing to join a broader movement that extends beyond our immediate area." Edmund felt a surge of hope as he recognized that the farmers were beginning to think strategically about resistance rather than simply expressing frustration about their circumstances. The transformation from individual despair to collective planning was exactly what he had hoped to achieve through calling the meeting, and it suggested that Lord Aldwin might face more formidable opposition than he had anticipated when he chose to target a military veteran with deep community connections. "Thomas speaks wisely about the need for broader organization," Edmund replied, his voice carrying growing confidence as he saw the farmers beginning to embrace the possibility of effective resistance. "I propose that we establish a formal association of independent farmers dedicated to defending our rights through legal means, economic cooperation, and mutual support against systematic persecution. We will document every abuse of power, support every family that faces retaliation, and present our case to every authority that might have the power to hold Lord Aldwin accountable for his crimes against honest working people." Within a month of the mill meeting, Edmund Thorne's informal association of independent farmers had evolved into a sophisticated resistance organization that operated with the disciplined efficiency of a military unit while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate agricultural cooperative focused on mutual aid and collective bargaining. The transformation reflected both Edmund's leadership abilities and the desperate determination of farmers who had finally found a viable alternative to individual submission or economic destruction at the hands of Lord Aldwin's systematic persecution campaign. The organization's headquarters were established in the backroom of Thomas Greenfield's trading post, a location that provided both security and convenient access to the network of roads that connected farming communities throughout the region. Edmund had applied lessons learned during his military service to create a communication system that used coded messages, trusted couriers, and predetermined meeting locations to coordinate activities while minimizing the risk of infiltration by Lord Aldwin's informants and agents. The intelligence reports from our contacts in Lord Aldwin's household staff have been invaluable in understanding his methods and anticipating his next moves, Edmund explained to the core leadership group that had emerged from the original mill meeting. We now know that he employs at least 15 paid informants throughout the farming districts, that he maintains detailed files on every family that has shown signs of resistance, and that he has begun coordinating with landowners in adjacent regions to share information and tactical approaches. Margaret Thorne, who had proven herself to be a skilled organizer and strategic thinker, spread several documents across the wooden table that served as their planning center. Our documentation efforts have identified 43 separate families who have lost their properties through Lord Aldwin's legal manipulation over the past 3 years, and we have gathered sworn statements from witnesses who can testify about systematic persecution, bribery of officials, and deliberate destruction of evidence that might have supported farmer appeals. The evidence they had assembled painted a clear picture of systematic corruption that extended far beyond the individual cases that had originally motivated their resistance. Lord Aldwin had created a network of complicit officials, intimidated witnesses, and manufactured legal justifications for property confiscations that enriched him personally while impoverishing entire communities that depended on independent farming for their economic survival. Thomas Greenfield consulted his own notes before adding information that reflected the broader scope of their investigation. Our contacts in the regional capital have confirmed that several prominent nobles have begun asking questions about the unusual concentration of property transfers in our district, and at least 2 investigators from the Royal Tax Authority have made inquiries about discrepancies between reported agricultural production and actual grain sales in local markets. This news represented the first indication that their efforts to document and publicize Lord Aldwin's corruption might be gaining attention from authorities with the power to intervene effectively. Edmund felt cautious optimism about the possibility that external pressure might force changes that local resistance alone could not achieve, but his military experience had taught him to prepare for escalation rather than assuming that political solutions would emerge without continued pressure. However, Thomas continued, his expression growing more serious, we have also received warnings that Lord Aldwin has begun recruiting armed men from outside the region, ostensibly to serve as additional security for his properties but actually to intimidate farmers and disrupt our organizational activities. Our sources suggest that he may be planning more direct action against our leadership in the near future. The threat of violence represented a significant escalation that required careful consideration of their tactical options and defensive preparations. Edmund had hoped that their focus on legal documentation and peaceful resistance would avoid the kind of direct confrontation that could provide justification for harsh suppression, but Lord Aldwin's willingness to employ armed intimidation suggested that he was becoming desperate enough to abandon subtlety in favor of more obvious coercion. If Lord Aldwin resorts to violence against peaceful farmers who are seeking legal redress for systematic persecution, he will expose himself to criminal charges that even his political connections cannot shield him from, Edmund observed, his strategic mind already calculating the potential advantages that could emerge from such desperate overreach. We must ensure that our response to any aggressive action is carefully documented and clearly defensive in nature, so that responsibility for escalation lies entirely with him and his associates. Jacob Millwright, whose family's earlier destruction had made him one of the most committed supporters of organized resistance, raised a concern that reflected the fears of many farmers who had joined their movement. Edmund, while I agree that documented violence against peaceful farmers would damage Lord Aldwin's position, we must also consider the immediate safety of our families and the protection of our properties while we wait for external authorities to intervene. The practical challenge of maintaining effective resistance while protecting vulnerable community members required the kind of complex planning that Edmund had encountered during military campaigns where civilian populations needed protection while strategic objectives were pursued against better-equipped enemies. The solution would need to balance defensive preparations with continued documentation efforts and political pressure that could achieve their objectives without providing justification for massive retaliation. The confrontation that had been building for months finally erupted on a cold November morning when Lord Aldwin arrived at Edmund Thorne's farm with 20 armed men, official confiscation documents, and the kind of arrogant confidence that came from years of successfully intimidating anyone who dared to challenge his authority. What he had not anticipated was finding Edmund waiting for him with 30 farmers armed with agricultural tools, hunting weapons, and the grim determination of people who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Edmund stood in his farmyard wearing the leather armor he had kept from his military service, His sword belted at his side, and his weathered face set with the expression of a man who had prepared for this moment through months of careful planning and tactical preparation. Behind him, the farmers who had joined his resistance movement formed a loose defensive line that demonstrated both their commitment to the cause and their readiness to back their convictions with physical courage if Lord Aldwin's intimidation escalated to actual violence. "Lord Aldwin," Edmund called out as the nobleman's entourage approached the farmhouse, his voice carrying the steady authority of a military commander addressing an enemy force. "You are trespassing on private property. I suggest you withdraw immediately before this situation develops in ways that serve no one's interests and create legal complications that your political connections may be unable to resolve." Lord Aldwin's response revealed both his surprise at encountering organized resistance and his growing desperation to maintain control through intimidation that had always proven effective in the past. "Edmund Thorne, you are in violation of multiple lawful orders requiring payment of taxes, compliance with agricultural regulations, and cooperation with official property assessments. I have legal authority to confiscate this farm and arrest you for seditious conspiracy against legitimate governance." The documents that Lord Aldwin brandished were indeed technically legal, having been processed through the network of complicit officials who had profited from years of systematic corruption, but their legitimacy was undermined by the documented evidence of systematic persecution that Edmund's organization had been gathering for months. More importantly, the presence of armed farmers willing to resist confiscation created a situation where legal technicalities were less important than practical considerations of power and political exposure. "Those documents were produced through a system of corruption that has enriched you personally while destroying honest farming families throughout this region," Edmund replied, his voice growing stronger as he sensed that Lord Aldwin was less confident than his aggressive approach suggested. "We have documented evidence of bribery, intimidation, and systematic abuse of legal processes that will be presented to royal investigators who are already conducting inquiries into irregularities in tax collection and property transfers in this district." The mention of royal investigators caused visible concern among Lord Aldwin's supporters, several of whom began exchanging nervous glances as they realized that their participation in systematic corruption might expose them to criminal charges that could result in imprisonment or execution. Lord Aldwin himself felt a flicker of uncertainty as he contemplated the possibility that his carefully constructed system of control might be unraveling in ways that threatened his own position rather than merely his expansion plans. Thomas Greenfield stepped forward from the line of farmers, carrying a leather portfolio that contained the documentation their organization had assembled over the past months. "Lord Aldwin, we have sworn statements from 43 families who have been systematically persecuted, financial records that demonstrate deliberate manipulation of tax assessments, and correspondence that proves coordination between your agents and complicit officials in multiple government departments." The comprehensive nature of the evidence that the farmers had assembled represented a level of organized resistance that Lord Aldwin had not anticipated when he began his campaign to acquire Edmund's property. His strategy had always depended on isolating individual targets who lacked the resources and knowledge necessary to document systematic corruption or organize effective opposition to his legal manipulation. Margaret Thorne emerged from the farmhouse carrying additional documents and accompanied by 3 women whose husbands had been imprisoned or driven into exile by Lord Aldwin's persecution. Their presence served as visible reminder of the human cost of his policies and the personal motivation that drove the farmers' willingness to risk everything in resistance to his continued oppression. "Furthermore," Margaret announced, her voice carrying clearly across the farmyard, "we have established communication with farmer organizations in 6 adjacent districts who face similar systematic persecution. Your methods of operation have become the subject of investigation by authorities who outrank your local allies and who have the power to hold you accountable for crimes against the people you were supposed to serve and protect." Lord Aldwin realized that he faced a situation that had evolved far beyond his ability to control through the methods that had proven successful in the past. The presence of armed farmers, documented evidence of systematic corruption, and external investigations created a combination of pressures that threatened not just his expansion plans but his continued freedom and political survival. "This is not over, Thorne," Lord Aldwin declared, his voice carrying the frustrated anger of a man who had built his power through intimidation but now faced opponents who refused to be intimidated. After several minutes of tense silence, Lord Aldwin made the decision that would define the remainder of the conflict. "This matter will be resolved through proper legal channels," he announced, his voice tight with controlled fury. I will not be drawn into violence by farmers who seek to provoke incidents that serve their political agenda. 6 months after the confrontation at Edmund Thorne's farm, Lord Aldwin Blackthorne sat in a cold prison cell awaiting trial on charges of systematic corruption, abuse of authority, extortion, and conspiracy to defraud the royal treasury through manipulation of tax collection procedures. The investigation that had begun with the farmers' documented complaints had expanded to reveal a network of corruption that extended throughout the regional administration and had cost the kingdom hundreds of thousands of silver pieces in lost revenue and illegally transferred properties. The evidence that Edmund's organization had assembled proved to be only the beginning of what royal investigators discovered when they began examining financial records, interviewing witnesses, and tracing the complex web of bribes, intimidation, and legal manipulation that had enabled Lord Aldwin's systematic oppression of farming communities. The scope of the corruption was so extensive that it had attracted the personal attention of the king himself, who had ordered a complete restructuring of regional administration to prevent similar abuse in the future. Edmund Thorne stood in the same farmyard where he had faced Lord Aldwin's final attempt at intimidation, but now he wore the blue and gold uniform of a royal agricultural inspector, a position that had been created specifically to prevent future systematic persecution of farming communities. His appointment to this role represented both recognition of his leadership in exposing corruption and confidence in his ability to protect farmers throughout the region from similar abuses of authority. The final property restoration orders have been completed, Margaret Thorne announced as she approached her husband with a leather portfolio containing documents that represented the culmination of their long struggle for justice. 41 of the 43 families who lost their farms to Lord Aldwin's confiscation procedures have been able to reclaim their properties, while the remaining 2 have chosen to accept monetary compensation and relocate to other regions where they can start fresh. The restoration of confiscated properties had required complex legal proceedings to untangle the web of fraudulent transfers, forged documents, and bribed officials that had enabled Lord Aldwin's systematic theft of farmland. The process had taken months to complete, but the royal investigators had been thorough in their efforts to ensure that every legitimate claim was honored and every family that had suffered persecution received appropriate compensation for their losses. Thomas Greenfield, whose trading post had served as headquarters for the resistance organization, joined them in the farmyard with news that reflected the broader transformation that had resulted from their successful challenge to systematic corruption. The new regional governor has announced the establishment of farmer advocacy offices in every district, staffed by officials who report directly to the royal administration rather than local nobles. No farmer will ever again face the kind of isolated persecution that Lord Aldwin was able to inflict through his control of local authorities. The institutional changes that had emerged from their struggle represented exactly the kind of systematic reform that Edmund had hoped to achieve when he first decided to organize resistance rather than submit to individual persecution. The new oversight mechanisms would protect future generations of farmers from the kind of abuse that had nearly destroyed their community, while the precedent of successful resistance would inspire others who faced similar oppression in different regions. Jacob Millwright, whose family had been among the first to lose their property to Lord Aldwin's systematic persecution, approached with his wife and children to express gratitude that had been years in the making. Edmund, when I first questioned whether resistance was possible, I could never have imagined that our struggle would result in such comprehensive reform. You showed us that courage and organization could overcome systematic oppression, and our children will grow up in a world where farmers have legal protections against the kind of abuse we endured. Edmund felt deep satisfaction as he contemplated the transformation that had resulted from their decision to organize collective resistance rather than accept individual destruction. The struggle had been longer and more dangerous than he had initially anticipated, but the results had exceeded his most optimistic expectations by creating institutional changes that would benefit farming communities throughout the kingdom. The real victory belongs to all of us who chose to stand together rather than submit separately, Edmund replied, his voice reflecting both humility about his own role and pride in what they had achieved through collective action. Lord Aldwin's power depended on our willingness to be isolated and intimidated as individuals, but when we united and documented his systematic corruption, we created pressure that forced external authorities to intervene and establish justice. Margaret added her own perspective on the lessons that their experience offered for others who might face similar challenges in the future. We learned that systematic oppression can be defeated through systematic resistance, but only when people are willing to support each other through the difficulties and dangers that such resistance inevitably entails. Our success was possible because farmers throughout the region chose cooperation over individual survival, and documentation over violent confrontation. As the sun set over fields that had been restored to their rightful owners, Edmund Thorne reflected on the journey that had transformed him from an isolated farmer facing impossible pressure to a royal official responsible for protecting agricultural communities throughout the region. The struggle against Lord Aldwin's systematic oppression had revealed both the vulnerability of ordinary people to abuse of authority and their collective power to demand justice when they organized effectively and maintained their commitment to peaceful but determined resistance. The story of their successful resistance became legendary throughout the kingdom, inspiring other communities that faced systematic oppression while demonstrating that even the most entrenched corruption could be defeated through courage, organization, and unwavering commitment to justice. Lord Aldwin's fall from power served as a warning to other nobles who might be tempted to abuse their authority, while the institutional reforms that emerged from the farmers' struggle created lasting protections that would benefit generations of working people throughout the realm.